the next speaker is Veeran Naicker, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for the Study of the Afterlife of Violence and the Reparative Quest here at Stellenbosch University.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. So my paper was the problem of epistemological critique in decolonial theory, and I looked at three specific areas in my paper. The one that decolonial theory's idea of indigenous or subaltern epistemology, in fact, is reducible to what postcolonial theorists of colonial discourse used to call the stereotype. I then look at decolonial theory's reading of Western epistemology and argue that it's an incoherent attempt to do justice to the last 50 years of Western philosophy of science, i.e. historical epistemology. And the third part of my paper looks at how decolonial theory ends up adopting metaphysical errors that are part of Western philosophy, and it ends up mirroring elements of the far right rather than any form of leftist social critique. So when I first read Walter Mignolo or Anibal Cujano's work on the coloniality of knowledge, I was struck by how some of the major claims that they made were similar to the early debates in what we now call postcolonial studies. So, i.e. the reception of Edward Said's seminal text, Orientalism, and the Birmingham Center for Cultural Studies under the guidance of Stuart Hall and to a lesser extent Paul Gilroy, and subaltern studies. So regardless of the methodological concerns that beset Said's work, his text pointed to two related problems that are now the contemporary concerns of decolonial theory. One, the stereotypical misrepresentation of non-Western cultures by a monolithic West, unified by an intention to control and dominate the other, and i.e. the silencing of that other, and with it, the denial of self-representation and political autonomy. So for the practitioners of early subaltern studies, Said's Orient could be applied as a schematic of misrepresentation to the colonial and elite Indian depiction of subaltern social collectivities, characterizing religion as the depoliticizing force of Indian social organization. In Gramsci, the notion of the subaltern was part of a methodological strategy to escape the rigid economism of Marxist-Leninism. If the peasantry were an accident of Marxist dialectical portrayal of history, then Gramsci sought to show that they were central to the process of modern hegemony. The declared aim of subaltern studies was to produce historical analyses in which subaltern groups were viewed as the somewhat heroic subjects of their own history. So one of the problematic methodological assumptions that Spivak's 1985 critique drew attention to was that subaltern theorists, like decolonial theorists today, believe that the subaltern consciousness could be accessed as a thing in itself, and that it remains somehow exterior to the elite discourses that it constituted. Stuart Hall similarly reminds us that this was not unique to subaltern studies. It was actually part of the projects of negritude and Pan-African philosophy. So the heroic staging of subaltern subjectivity often coincided with a second intellectual inheritance that decolonial theory has employed as a critical trope: the stereotypical denigration of a unitary Western subject, and consequently epistemology that is the root of all civilizational crises and a symptomatic will to conquer. In fact, although most post-colonial scholars were quite radical in their efforts to demonstrate how colonial and racializing discourses inform many aspects of Western culture, including some of their own theoretical influences, they have, to my knowledge, been quite subtle in their treatment of Western dissident traditions, particularly post-structuralism, feminism, and psychoanalysis. So their cosmopolitan commitment, especially considerate of the rights of minorities and women, understands that these traditions offer the possibility of transforming our condition and our world as planetary problematics. This is why, for so many activists working with the unequal and somewhat colonial impact of climate change, the application and understanding of scientific knowledge was essential to the post-colonial understanding of today's precariat. So this takes me to the internal contradictions that arise in decolonial theory's history of the last 500 years, defined by the enterprises of the ego conquero and coloniality. It is worth noting that when decolonial theory emerged, one of its protagonists, Walter Mignolo, argued that the post-colonial employment of post-structural concepts was limited to the diasporic and South Asian experience of colonialism. The specificity and irreducibility of the Latin American colonial experience required new concepts, which now, ironically, have been employed in decolonial circles as a universal account of the colonial experience, despite decolonial theory's claim to be giving a partial perspective of the colonial condition. As the emphasis is on epistemic relativism. The notion of epistemic violence, i.e. forced cultural assimilation, as emblematic of the colonial condition, enables the very idea of a global Western epistemological system, or the coloniality of knowledge. In this process, each indigenous religious cosmology or ethnos is disqualified by the colonial force of Western secularity, and its adherents are subsequently alienated as converts. Right, okay. So the idea that colonial rule could use indigenous systems of governance does not square well with decolonial theory's sanctification of the pre-colonial as an unproblematic source of virtue or ethnic system. In fact, the 500-year system that decolonial theory presents as a meta-framework that we can employ to understand the world system begins to closely correspond to an albeit inverted Eurocentric historicism that employed the white transcendental subject as the driving force of historical change, a mode of historiography and colonial discourse that Robert Young once identified as a white mythology. What I find particularly interesting is how influential this characterization of rational Western epistemology, as defined by the subject-object dualism, has been in the humanities and the social sciences, especially when decolonial theory enters a field of debate transformed by the discursive turn, which happened over half a century ago, which effaced, or at least attempted to efface, the author or the epistemic sovereignty of the subject. Young's book on postcolonial theory was written some 30 years ago, but still remains a corrective to most of the theoretical problems in decolonial theory. Thank you.